You wake up to the loud ringing of bells cutting through the dark, like a sharp sound piercing the quiet night. Your breath forms little clouds in the cold air of the dormitory, and your small hands shake as you pull the rough woolen robe over your head. You're only 7 years old, and your bare feet feel cold against the stone floor, but you've stopped noticing the chill by now. Around you, 20 other girls are moving quietly, their faces pale like wax in the dim light coming through small windows. One girl who can't be older than 5 is struggling to put on her robe. You want to help her, but you remember what happened to Margaret when she tried to comfort a crying child last week. 3 whole days without 3 days of kneeling on dried scattered across the chapel floor until her knees bled through her stockings. This isn't a school. This isn't a safe place. This is Whitby Abbey in Yorkshire, England, in the year 1247. And you're here not because you want to be. Because your father needed to make a deal with the church. And your childhood ended the moment those childhood ended the moment those heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind you. You'll never see your mother again. You'll never run through fields or laugh freely. You'll never taste honey cakes or feel the warmth of family. Instead, you'll spend the next 10 years learning that to survive here, you must obey perfectly. You must obey hunger as a way of serving God. That hunger is a way of serving God, your only friend. And that silence is your only friend. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of struggle and survival, if you enjoy uncovering hidden pieces of history, please hit that like subscribe, and don't forget to comment below to tell me where you're listening from. It's amazing how across time and space we can come together through our shared curiosity about the past. Dawn breaks with the first bell ringing at 4 a.m. here. No sunrise brings warmth or hope, just another day of duty. Children as young as 5 crawl out of their straw beds, their bodies stiff from sleeping on cold floors that never warm up. In rooms where their breath freezes and rats scurry between the stones. At Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, founded in 88 AD, the dormitory held girls from noble families sent here like unwanted belongings. Lady Giver of Mercia sent her youngest daughter Edith to this place in 1043 AD, when Edith was just 4 years old. Political alliances required sacrifice, and in those times daughters were seen as nothing more than a tool for power. Edith's story lives on in bits and pieces from the Abbey's old records, written by Abbess Elfgoo in careful Latin. Little Edith, she wrote, weeps without stopping for 3 days and nights. Her tears freeze on her cheeks in the morning cold. She calls for her mother in Saxon, but here we only speak Latin. She must learn that her mother is gone, and that God is her only father now. Imagine these children stumbling through their first weeks. Their hair, once lovingly braided by servants, now chopped off to stop them from feeling proud of their appearance. Their soft silk gowns replaced by scratchy wool robes that rub against their skin. Their hands, once soft and protected by gloves, are now cracked and bleeding from the cold and hard work. Lady Matilda Fitzwalter, who was sent to God's Abbey near Oxford in 1185 at the age of 6, wrote years later in a letter secretly sent to her sister. I remember the taste of sweet spring and the softness of fur against my cheek. Now I know only the taste of barley porridge and the feel of rough hemp against my skin. Sometimes I wonder if those early memories were just dreams, because this stone world feels too real to have ever been anything else. In these places, silence wasn't just golden. It was necessary for survival. From morning prayers until the last bell at night, speaking was only allowed for lessons or confession. The girls learned to communicate with each other without words. They used their eyes, the way they moved their hands during prayer, or how they stood at mealtime. A tilted head might mean someone was hungry. The way a girl held her prayer book that she was feeling sick. The way someone stood during might be a sign of deep sadness. At Barking Abbey in Essex, famous for its harsh silence was broken only by the sound of leather hitting. The punishment room was a small stone space where girls were taken for even the smallest mistakes, smiling during prayers or walking too slowly in the procession. It was a world where children were stripped of their childhood, forced to obey without question, fear, and live in constant fear. Sister Manad, who was in charge of punishment from 1203 to 1219, kept detailed notes about the punishment she gave out. Her records read like a list of cruelty. Alicia, only 7 years old, was struck 5 times with a rod for laughing during Mass. Marguerite, at age 9, 15 times for speaking during the reading of the Bible. Beatus, just 5, was held by the arms and struck 10 times for wetting her bed. These punishments weren't rare. They happened every day. Children lived in constant fear of making mistakes, even mistakes they didn't realize were wrong. Joanna, the youngest daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, was sent to Fontaud Abbey in France in 1176 when she was just 11 years old. Her letters to her mother, which were found in the Abbey's archives in the 1800s, show how a child's spirit was slowly crushed under the weight of constant surveillance and punishment. Dearest mother, she wrote, I've learned to move like a shadow, breathe like a whisper. Yesterday I was beaten for letting my mind wander during prayers. How do they know what I think? How do they know what I think? They can see inside my mind. I fear they can see my dreams of home. Food wasn't seen as nourishment. It was used as punishment and control. Children ate only once a day, or maybe twice if they were lucky. Their meals were mostly gruel, black bread and water. Meat was a luxury, only served on the highest holy days, and even then it was given in tiny amounts. At Wilton Abbey in Wiltshire, breakfast was just a small piece of bread and a cup of water. Dinner was barley porridge, sometimes with a few vegetables from the Abbey's garden. The children who arrived from noble homes, chubby and well-fed, quickly became thin and weak, their cheeks hollow and eyes too big for their faces. But hunger wasn't a mistake. It was a spiritual discipline, a way to force the body into submission to God's will. The nuns didn't seem to realize that hungry children couldn't focus on prayers. They couldn't learn properly. All they could think about was hoarding breadcrumbs in their clothes, dreaming of feasts instead of salvation. Agnes of Bohemia, the daughter of King Ottar I, was sent to a convent in Prague in 1234 at the age of 8. Her confessor, Brother Francis, wrote to her father saying, Your daughter speaks of nothing but food. She counts the hours between meals. She cries not for your absence, but for memories of roasted chicken and sweet wine. This is not devotion, Sweet Wine. This is not devotion, Your Majesty. Winter in these stone buildings was especially harsh. There was barely any heat, just small fires in the chapel, and maybe the library. The dormitories were cold, even when snow piled up against the windows and ice formed on the water basins. The children slept in shared beds, huddled together for warmth. The children slept in 3 or 4 to a narrow straw mattress. At Neminster Abbey in Winchester, built in 1902, the dormitory was a long, narrow room with no windows. The dormitory was a long, narrow room with no windows. The girls slept fully dressed, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. The girls slept fully dressed, with frostbite on their fingers and toes. Lady Isabel de Clare, who was sent to Wainsbury Abbey in Wiltshire in 1248 at the age of 6, later wrote in her adult memoir, I remember the sound of teeth chattering in the dark. I remember the sound of teeth chattering in the dark. I remember the girl next to me, Marie, who was only 5. I remember the girl next to me, Marie, who couldn't speak English, who was only 5 every night for a Normandy. She couldn't speak English and cried every night for her nurse. Her lips were blue like violets. She wouldn't wake up. They carried her away while we said our morning prayers. They carried her away while we said our morning prayers. It was as if she had never existed. We never spoke of her again. Death was common and hardly ever existed. Children died from the cold and hardly ever sickness, from hunger. Children died from the cold. Abbey records show that nearly 30% of children under 10 in a matter-of-fact way. Their deaths were written down in a matter-of-fact way. In Shaftesbury Abbey, or further death records for 1209, Shaftesbury Abbey. The death records for 1209, who died of fever on the feast of St. Michael, Marguerite, who died of fever on the feast of St. Wasting sickness on the feast of St. Luke, age 7, Beatrice, who died of a wasting sickness on the feast of St. Luke, tuberculosis on the feast of St. Martin. There were no family notifications, no big funerals. There were no family notifications, no big funerals. These children's lives were reduced to a few lines in cemetery. These children's lives were reduced to a few lines. It was very basic, just enough to read prayers in Latin and memorize religious texts. Just enough to read writing prayers in Latin and memorize religious texts. Usually those writing was only taught to a few select girls, Math
usually
didn't
those
exist.
destined for
History
administrative
was
roles
mostly
in the
just
convent.
Bible stories.
Math didn't
and
exist.
the lives of saints.
History was mostly
Science
just
was considered
Bible stories
dangerous
because
and
it
the
might
lives
make
of
them
saints.
question God's
Science
mysteries.
was considered dangerous
At Loch
because
Abbey
it
in
might make them
Wiltshire,
question
founded
God's
in
mysteries.
1229,
At
the
Loch Abbey
curriculum
in
was
Wiltshire,
mostly about
founded
memorizing
in
Psalms,
1229,
learning to sew
the
church
curriculum was
clothes,
mostly
and
about
studying the
memorizing
lives of female
Psalms,
saints.
learning to sew
Lady
church
Ella of
clothes,
Salisbury,
and
who
studying
founded
the
the
lives
Abbey,
of female saints.
wrote in her charter,
Lady Ella
"Let
of
the young
Salisbury,
maids learn
who
submission
founded
through
the Abbey,
Scripture,
wrote in her
patience through
charter,
needlework,
let the young
and
maids
humility
learn
through the
submission
study of
through
those holy
Scripture,
women
who
who
suffered
suffered
for
for Christ."
needlework and
There was no
humility
mention of
through the
arithmetic,
study of those
medicine,
holy women
or
who
literature
suffered for Christ.
outside religious
There was
texts.
no mention of arithmetic.
These children weren't
medicine,
being taught to
or
think for
literature
themselves
outside
they were
religious
being
texts.
trained to obey.
These children
Physical
weren't being taught
punishment
to
was
think
not
for
only
themselves,
accepted,
they were being
it
trained
was
to
seen as
obey.
necessary for
Physical
spiritual
punishment
growth.
was not only
The
accepted,
rod,
it was
strap,
seen as
and
necessary for
fasting were all
spiritual
tools
growth.
for salvation.
The rod,
Girls
the
who
strap,
showed signs
and
of
fasting
independence or
were all
creativity
tools
were
for
beaten
salvation
until they
Girls
learned to
who showed
conform.
signs of
At
independence
Dartford
or
Priory in
creativity
Kent,
were
founded
beaten
in
until they learned to
1355,
conform.
the rule
At
said,
Dartford Priory
"Spare
in
not
Kent,
the rod,
founded
for it
in
is through suffering that the
1355,
young
the
soul
rule
learns to
said,
love God above
"Spare
all
not the
earthly
rod,
things."
for it is through
The
suffering
abbess,
that the
Dame
young
Joan
soul
Vox,
learns to love
was
God
famous for her
above all
harsh
earthly
methods.
things.
She kept a collection
abbess,
of willow switches
Dame
in her
Joan
room,
Vox,
each
was
one
famous
marked
for
with the
her
name of a
harsh
girl
methods.
she had punished.
She kept a
Parents
collection
who
of
came
willow
to visit their
switches in her
daughters
room,
saw the
each
welts on
one
their
marked
backs
with
with
the
the name
arms,
of a girl
but
she had
said nothing.
punished.
To
Parents who
question
came
the
to visit
abbess
their
was to
daughters
question
saw the
God
welts on
himself.
their backs.
Sister
and arms,
Marguerite of
but said
Hainaut,
nothing. Who was in
to
charge of
question the
new
abbess
girls
was
at
to
Poisy
question
Abbey
God
in France
himself.
from 1298
Sister Marguerite
to
of Hainaut,
1315,
who was in charge
wrote
of new
about these
girls at
practices
Poisy
in her
Abbey in
private
France
journal.
from 1298 to
ChatGPT said,
1315.
"Today I
wrote
had to
about
punish
these
little
practices
Blanche,
in her
only
private
8
journal.
years old.
Today
by
I had to
striking her
punish
20
little
times
Blanche
with a rod.
only 8
She
years
asked
old
why
by
God lets
striking her
people
20
suffer,
times with a
especially
rod.
why her baby
She asked
brother
why God
died,
lets people
if God
suffer,
truly loves children.
especially why her
Questions
baby
like
brother
these
died.
are dangerous.
If God truly
They make
loves
you doubt,
children,
and doubt
questions
is the
like
enemy of
these are
faith.
dangerous.
It's better for her
They
to
make
learn
you
through
doubt,
pain
and
than
doubt
to think
is the
too
enemy
much,
of faith,
because reason
it's
can
better
lead
for
to
her to
sin.
learn through pain
Sleep was
than to
interrupted
think
every
too
night for
much,
prayers,
because reason
the children
can lead
had to wake
sin.
up at midnight for
Sleep
matins.
was interrupted
Then again
every night
at
for
3
prayers.
a.m. for the
The
Lord's
children
Prayer,
had to wake
and
up at
once more at
midnight for
dawn for
matins.
prime.
Then
Their
again
bodies,
at 3
already
a.m. for the
weakened
Lord's
from poor
Prayer,
food and
and
cold,
once more at
were
dawn
made
for
worse by
prime.
constant
Their
sleep
bodies
deprivation.
already weakened
At
from
God's
poor
to
food
Abbey,
and cold,
where Mistress
were
Rose
made worse
Clifford
by
was buried in
constant sleep
1176.
deprivation.
At God's
The
to
bells
Abbey,
rang so
where
often
Mistress
that the
Rose
children became
Clifford
like
was buried in
sleepwalkers.
1176.
They'd get up, say their
The
prayers
bells
while
rang
barely
so
awake,
often that the
their
children
eyes
became
opened but
like
not seeing,
sleepwalkers,
and
they
chant
get up,
prayers
say
they had
their prayers
memorized
while
without
barely awake,
understanding them.
their eyes
Lady
opened but
Alice
not seeing,
Fitzhugh,
and
who
chant
lived at
prayers they
God's
had
to Abbey
memorized
starting
without
in
understanding them.
1289.
Lady
Lady
to her
Alice
niece,
Fitzhugh,
I learned
who
to
lived
pray
at
in my
God's
sleep
Abbey
to
starting
sing
in
psalms while my
1289,
mind drifted off
wrote
to
to a
memories
niece,
of sunlight
I
and
learned to
laughter.
pray in my sleep
We were like
to
clockwork
sing
dolls,
psalms while my
wound up
mind
drifted
drifted
off
off
to
by the
memories
bells.
of sunlight
I was
and
afraid that if
laughter.
the bells
We
ever
were like
stopped,
clockwork
I would
dolls,
fall apart,
wound up each
because I had
morning by the
forgotten how to
bells.
move without
I was
them.
afraid that if the bells
Emotional
ever stopped,
connections
I
were
would fall
discouraged,
apart.
because
Children
I had
were
forgotten
taught that
how to
loving your
move
family
without
was
them.
wrong, that
Emotional
forming close
connections were
friendships was
discouraged.
sinful. Children
and
were
that
taught that
attachments to
loving
anything
your
on
family
earth
was
got in the
wrong,
way of
that
salvation.
forming close
At
friendships
Stowe
was
Abbey in
sinful,
Bedfordshire,
and that
where
attachments
John
to anything
Bunyan
on
would
earth
later
got
get
in
the
the way of
idea for
salvation.
Pilgrim's
At
Progress.
Stowe Abbey in
Girls
Bedfordshire,
weren't allowed to
where
form
John
close
Bunyan would
bonds
later
with each
get the
other.
idea for
They were
Pilgrim's
moved
Progress.
between dormitories,
Girls weren't allowed to
often
form
to
close
stop them
bonds
from
with each
becoming
other.
attached to
They were
anyone.
moved between
Letters from
dormitories,
home
often
were
to
read
stop
aloud
them
to
from
everyone,
becoming attached
so
to
no
anyone.
one could have
Letters
private
from
comfort.
home were read aloud
Gifts
to
from
everyone,
families were
so
taken
no
away
one could have
and
private
shared
comfort.
equally among all
Gifts
the children.
from families
So
were
there was
taken
no
away
feeling
and
of
shared
individual
equally
love.
among all
Dame
the children.
Clemens of Barking,
So there was no
who
feeling
ran
of
Barking
individual
Abbey
love.
from
Dame
1173
Clemens
to
of Barking,
1186,
who ran
made a
Barking Abbey
rule
from
that the girls weren't allowed
1173
to
to
talk about their
1186,
families or lives
made a rule that
before
the girls
coming to
weren't
allowed
convent.
to talk about
The
their
past is
families or
dead,
lives
she
before
said.
coming to the
Only
convent.
serving God
The past
now
is dead,
matters, she
if
said.
a child mentioned
Only
her
serving
family,
God
she was
now
punished by
matters.
being locked
If
in
a
a stone
child
cell
mentioned
with
her
only bread and
family,
water.
she was
until
punished
she
by
agreed
being
to
locked
let
in
go
a
of
stone
those
cell with
worldly
only
thoughts.
bread and water.
A young
until she
girl
agreed
named
to let
Maud de
go of
Brass,
those worldly
who was sent
thoughts.
to a priory in
A young
Herefordshire
girl named
in
Maud de Brass,
1235 at
who
age
was sent to a
7,
priory in
secretly wrote in
Herefordshire
her diary,
in
I try to remember
1235
my
at
mother's
age 7,
face,
but
secretly
it's
wrote in
fading
her
each day.
diary, I
Sister
try to remember
Agatha
my
says
mother's
this is
face,
good,
but
but
I
it's
should love
fading
God
each day.
more than anything else.
Sister Agatha
But I
says
don't
this is
feel
good,
love for God.
that I should love God
feel
more than
empty,
anything else,
like something
but I don't
precious has
feel
been
love
taken
for
from
God.
me. I feel
I pretend
empty,
to be holy,
like
but
something
inside
precious
I
has
feel
been
hollow.
taken from me.
The abuse
I pretend
wasn't
to be
just formal
holy,
punishment,
but inside,
children were often
I feel
slapped
hollow.
for small things.
The abuse
pinched
wasn't
for
just
not paying
formal
attention,
punishment, or smacked
children
for showing
were
any
often
emotion.
slapped for small
At Romey
things,
Abbey in Hampshire,
pinched for
where
not
St.
paying
Christina of
attention,
Marquette
or
found
smacked for
refuge
showing
in
any
1114.
emotion.
At
What they
Romey
called
Abbey in
correction
Hampshire,
was used
where
daily.
St. Christina of
This
Marquette
was just a way
found
of using
refuge
fear
in
to control the
1114.
children.
What they
They
called
learned to
correction
flinch at sudden
was used
movements,
daily.
keep their
This was
heads
just a
down,
way of
and
using
speak
fear
only
to
when
control the
spoken to.
children. At
We learn to
Shaftesbury Abbey,
flinch at sudden
a young
movements,
girl named
keep their heads
Adelheid,
down,
who was there in
speak only when
1267,
spoken to, drew tiny
sexual
pictures
abuse,
of children,
while
with
never
tears
officially
on their
admitted,
faces in the
was
margins of a
documented in
manuscript.
confession records.
These drawings
and
were
private
only
letters.
found in
Adwell Abbey in
1923,
Hampshire,
during the
founded in
restoration of the manuscript.
986.
Art historians
and a letter
believe
written
these
by
were
Father
secret
Edmund the
messages,
Confessor in
a way for the
1278.
children to express
He
their
wrote to his
pain
bishop,
and fear
saying,
when they
"I've
couldn't
heard
speak
troubling
it
things in
aloud."
confession.
The pictures
Young
were simple
girls are
but
talking
powerful.
about being touched
Children with big
inappropriately,
eyes,
by
hands
older
covering
nuns,
their mouths,
being made to lie
bodies
with
hunched
sisters for
over,
warmth
as
in
if
ways
constant
that
fear.
disturb their innocence.
Sexual abuse,
don't know
while
how to
never
advise
officially
them,
admitted,
because they're
was
afraid of
documented in
punishment if they
confession
resist.
records and
But
private
these
letters.
practices are surely
Atwell
harming
Abbey
their
in
souls.
Hampshire,
Founded in
Agnes of Huntington,
986,
who ran Stow Abbey
had a
from
letter written by
1257
Father
to
Edmund the
1281,
Confessor in
was
1278.
investigated by church
He wrote to his
authorities
bishop,
after
saying,
several noble
"I've heard
families
troubling things in
accused
confession.
her of improper
Young
behavior
girls are
with
talking
the
about
younger
being
girls.
touched inappropriately
Letters
by
between
older
Bishop
nuns,
Hugh of Lincoln
being made to
and the
lie with
Archbishop of
sisters for
Canterbury
warmth in
described
ways
the
that
disturbing
disturb their
acts with the
innocence.
girls.
I don't know
The
how to
investigation
advise
was
them,
quietly
because
dropped
they're
when
afraid
Dame
of
Agnes
punishment
made
if they
large
resist.
donations to the
These
church,
practices are
and the
surely
families who
harming their
complained were
souls.
threatened with
Dame Agnes
excommunication
of
if they kept
Huntington, who
talking.
ran Stow Abbey
Lady
from
Isabel de
1257
Fortibus,
to
the
1281,
daughter of the Earl of
was
Devon,
investigated by
was
church
removed from
authorities
Canons Abbey in
after several
1284
noble families
after she sent a
accused her of
secret
improper
message to her
behaviour
father
with the
about
younger girls.
inappropriate touching
Letters
in the
between
dark.
Bishop Hugh of
Her
Lincoln
father wrote to
and the
King Edward
Archbishop of
I,
Canterbury,
saying,
"My
described
daughter talks
disturbing
about
acts
things
with
that
the
can't be
girls.
named.
The investigation was
who
quietly
come to her
dropped
bed at
when
night
Dame
and do
Agnes made
things that
large
aren't right.
donations to the church.
When I asked the
and
abbess,
families who
she claimed
complained
my
were
daughter
threatened
was
with
just overly
excommunication
religious,
if they kept talking.
but I saw the marks on
Lady
her body
Isabel de
and the fear
Fortibus,
in her eyes.
the daughter of the Earl
I
of
can't
Devon,
leave her there
was
in that
removed from
place of
Canons Abbey in
corruption.
1284.
The mental
after she
toll
sent
of
a
this
secret
abuse and
message to her
isolation
father
was severe.
about inappropriate
Children who
touching in the
survived
dark.
often
Her
struggled
father
with what
wrote
we
to
would
King
now
Edward
recognise
I,
as
saying,
trauma.
My
They had
daughter
trouble
talks about
making
things
friends,
that can't be
suffered
named,
from
about
nightmares and
sisters who come
anxiety,
to a bed at night
and battled
do things
depression.
that aren't right.
Lady Margaret
When I
Bowett,
asked the abbess,
who spent 3
she
years
claimed
at
my daughter
Maxtwick
was just
Priory
overly
from
religious,
1439
but I saw the
to
marks on her
1442
body and the
AD,
fear in her
wrote in
eyes.
her private
I
book,
can't leave her there
"I'm
in that
30
place of
now,
corruption,
and I still wake
the
up
medical
in fear
care
when
was
I hear
poor
church bells,
and often dangerous.
I still count the
Children
hours
who got
between
sick
meals.
were treated with
I moved
bloodletting,
quietly around
purging,
my house
and
like any
prayer.
noise might bring
At Wilton
punishment.
Abbey, the sick
Some
room was
children
a tiny
tried to
stone
escape,
room
with
with
no
no
windows
windows
and barely any heat.
In 1278,
Sick children were
at God's
isolated,
to Abbey,
left to
a
either
girl named
recover
Mabel
or
from
die with
Gloucester
little to no help.
hid in a cart
Sister
filled with
Merciful,
supplies going to
a chronicler
Oxford,
at the Abbey
hoping
in
to get away.
1245,
She was
wrote,
caught and brought
"Little
back,
Constance has a
then locked
fever
in a
that
dark,
burns her
tiny
up
punishment
and makes
cell
her
for
speak
3
in
months.
strange tongues.
When they finally let
These
her
children
out,
lived
the
in
other children
fear,
said she
pain,
couldn't
and
speak properly
loneliness,
anymore,
often
and would
without
rock
any
back and
real
forth,
care or
humming a
understanding.
strange tune.
We've tried everything to help her,
Kent,
bleeding her 3
Dallas of
times and
Normandy,
giving her bitter
the abbess
herbs.
from
She
1289
just
to
keeps getting weaker.
135 AD.
The abbess says it's
kept
God's
detailed
will
records of
that maybe her
escape
suffering
attempts.
will bring us
One
all
girl,
grace.
Marie,
Some of the
tried
older
to
nuns
climb the walls
practiced
during
herbal
morning
medicine,
prayers, but
though it
fell
often
and
mixed
broke
with
her arm.
superstitions
Dallas
and
wrote
religious
it off as
rituals.
punishment from
At
God for
Arnsbury
her
Abbey,
disobedience.
Sister Boretus,
Another
the
girl,
herbalist,
Catherine,
kept
tried to
careful
hide
notes
in a
on her
hay wagon
treatments.
bound for
If
Canterbury.
a child had a
but she was
fever,
found and
she'd
brought
mix
back.
wormwood
And
with
Isabel
holy water
pretended
and
to be
blessed
sick so
salt.
she could go to the
If the fever
infirmary
didn't break,
and escape.
she'd apply
Her
leeches
plan
to the
failed
temples while
too.
chanting prayers.
All these efforts
If
were
the
labelled
fever
as
finally
acts of
ended,
defiance.
they would give thanks
as though the
to
children's
Saint Denner.
unwillingness
But if
to
the
submit
child
to their
died,
strict,
they would
painful
thank God
lives
for
was a
taking
sin.
an innocent soul to
What's
heaven.
most heartbreaking,
The mental
is how
toll
these
of this
children were
abuse and
systematically
isolation
broken
was
down.
severe.
They came
Children
to the
who
Abbey with their
survived
own
often struggled
personalities
with
with
what
what
we
we
would
would
now
now
recognise as
but they were
trauma.
forced to give
They
all
had
that
trouble
up.
making friends,
Their spirits
suffered
were
from
crushed as they
nightmares
were
and
taught that
anxiety,
their thoughts,
and
their
battled
emotions,
depression.
and even their bodies
What's most
were wrong.
heartbreaking is
They
how
learned
these
to feel their
children
own
were
minds,
systematically broken
distrust
down.
their feelings.
They came to
and
the
obey
Abbey with their
authority
own
without
personality,
question.
dreams
Barking
and
Abbey,
desires.
Sister
But they
Euphemia
were
wrote
forced
about
to
a
give
young
all
girl
that
named
up.
Lady Philippa.
At Romey Abbey,
She had
Dame
arrived full of
Scholastica,
pride
the
and
novice
stubbornness,
mistress,
bragging
wrote
about her silk
instructions for
gowns
training
and pet
girls.
falcon.
She taught them that their
months of
will was
pressure,
corrupt,
she came to
and their
Euphemia
desires were
and
evil.
begged for forgiveness.
They had to learn to
She even
hate
asked
what
for
they her
once
beautiful
loved,
hair to be
and
cut
find
shorter,
peace
her
only in
meals to be
complete
reduced
surrender to
further,
authority,
and for extra punishments
Ironically,
to show her
many of these
submission.
children came
This
from
wasn't
wealthy,
education.
powerful
It was a
families
complete
who
destruction
could have
of
given
who
them a
these children
comfortable
were,
life,
turning
good
them into hollow
education,
vessels
and
that
bright
only knew
futures.
obedience.
But instead,
At
they
Rome
were
Abbey,
sent to these
Dame
abbeys to be
Scholastica,
sacrificed
the
to
novice
political
mistress,
gain,
wrote
religious
instructions for
fanaticism,
training girls,
and the belief that
she taught them
suffering
that their
somehow
will
made
was
them
corrupt,
purer.
and their desires
Lady
were
Eleanor
evil.
de Montfort,
They had to learn to
daughter of
hate
the
what they
famous
once
Simon de
loved,
Montfort,
and find
was
peace
sent to
only in
Amesbury
complete
Abbey in
surrender to authority.
1265 AD.
Ironically,
When she was just
many of
8
these
years
children
old,
came from
after her
wealthy,
father died
powerful
in
families.
She
who
wrote
could
to her
have given
mother,
them a
"I had
comfortable
everything
life, a
any
good
child could
education,
want,
and bright
books,
futures,
music, fine
but
clothes,
instead,
loving
they were
servants.
sent to these
Now,
abbeys to be
I have nothing
sacrificed
but
to
political
cold stone
gain,
walls and
religious
endless prayers.
fanaticism.
They tell
and
me
the
I'm
belief
closer
that
to God than
suffering
those who
somehow
live
made
in the
them
world,
purer.
but I feel
Lady
farther
Eleanor
from
de
heaven than
Montfort,
ever. How
daughter
can
of
a god of
famous
love let
Simon
this
de
kind of
Montfort,
misery
was
happen
sent to
to his
Amesbury
smallest
Abbey in
children?
1265 AD.
The medical
when she
consequences
was
of the
just
harsh
8
conditions
years
were
old,
severe and
after
well
her father
documented.
died in battle.
At Wilton
She
Abbey,
wrote to her
the
mother,
death records
"I had
show that
everything
nearly half
any
of all
child could
children who
want:
were sent there
books,
didn't
music,
survive
fine
into
clothes,
adulthood.
loving
The
servants.
causes were varied
Now
but
I have nothing
predictable.
but cold stone
Malnutrition,
walls and endless
disease,
prayers.
exposure.
They tell me I'm closer
and
to
what the
God than
chroniclers
those who live
called
in the world,
failure to
but
thrive.
I feel farther from heaven
Today,
than ever."
doctors would
How can a
recognize
god
these
of love
deaths as the
let
result
this
of
kind of
systematic
misery
neglect
happen to her
and
smallest
abuse.
children?
Sister
Some
Margaret,
children found small
the
ways to keep
caregiver
their
at
spirits
Shaftesbury
alive.
Abbey, wrote
At
in
Shaftesbury
1289
Abbey,
AD.
an archaeological
Young
dig in the
Beatrice is growing
1960s
thinner
uncovered
each
a
day,
collection of
even though we
small
try
hidden
to feed
treasures
her.
in the
She can't
dormitory
keep
walls.
food down.
There was a
and
wooden
talks
doll,
constantly
a piece
about
of
her
coloured
mother.
glass.
I fear her body
pressed
is failing
flower,
because her
and a
spirit
letter
is
written by a
broken.
child.
The abbess
The letter,
claimed,
in
"This is
Norman
God's
French,
will."
said,
But
"My
Sister
name is
Margaret
Eleanor.
had seen
I'm
many
7
children
years
die
old.
in the same
I've been
way.
here for 2 years.
Their bodies seem to
I
give
remember
up
my
when
mother's
their
voice
hearts
when
are
she
broken,"
sang to me.
she noted.
I remember my
The
father's
idea
beard
of failure
against
to
my
thrive
cheek.
wasn't
I
known
remember
back
my
then,
dog
but
Rousseau,
the symptoms were
who would
clear.
sleep at the foot
Children
of my
who
bed.
couldn't cope
These
with the
little
harsh
items
conditions
were the children's way of
slowly
holding
wasting
on to
away,
their humanity
becoming
and their
weak
memories,
and lifeless,
refusing to
eventually
let it
dying
all
without
be taken
any
away.
clear physical
Remember,
cause.
earthly
Today's understanding
happiness
of
is
trauma
short-lived,
would
but
recognize that
heavenly
these children's
rewards are
psychological
forever.
stress
Endure
showed
your
up as
struggles
physical
with
symptoms,
patience,
leading
knowing
to their
that I am
deaths.
proud of your
The
sacrifice.
education these children
These letters
received
show
was
that
minimal
parents
and
believed
focused
they were doing
only
what
on
was
religious
best for their
teachings.
children.
At
They
Luck
thought
Abbey,
suffering had
the
some
children
kind of
spent their
value,
days
that
memorizing
breaking a
Latin
child's
prayers,
spirit could be
reading
an act of
simple
love.
religious texts,
The way they
and
justified
learning
their
basic
actions
skills
is
like
disturbingly
embroidery and
similar to
copying
the
manuscripts.
tactics used by abusers
There was no
throughout
instruction in
history.
subjects
They
like
claimed
math,
that pain
science,
was necessary,
history, or
that it
literature,
built character,
except for religious
and that it
texts.
served a higher purpose.
The goal wasn't to educate.
The medical
but to
consequences of the
indoctrinate.
harsh conditions
Dame
were
Ella of
severe and
Salisbury,
well
who
documented.
founded Lacock
At
Abbey,
Wilton Abbey,
wrote in
the death
1232
records show
AD,
that nearly
"Let
half
the
of
young
all
girls
children
learn
who were
only
sent
what is
there
necessary
didn't
to serve
survive
God.
into adulthood.
Too much learning
The causes
creates
were varied
pride,
but
and
predictable.
pride leads to sin.
Malnutrition,
It's better they
disease,
remain ignorant
exposure,
of worldly
and what the
knowledge,
chroniclers
and
called
pure in their
failure to
devotion,
thrive.
and be clever
Today,
with words, but
doctors would
corrupt in their
recognize
hearts.
these deaths as the
This
result of
restriction on
systematic
education
neglect and abuse
served many
Sister
purposes.
Margaret,
It kept
the
the
caregiver
children
at
dependent on
Shaftesbury
their
Abbey,
religious leaders,
wrote in
stopped
1289
them from
AD,
developing
young
critical
Beatrice
thinking
is growing
skills that
thinner
might
each
challenge
day,
authority,
even though we
and
tried to
ensured
feed
they
her.
couldn't function
She can't keep
independently
food
if
down
they ever
and
left
talks
the abbey.
constantly about her
The physical
mother.
conditions
I
at
fear
these
her
places
body is
were
failing
harsh on
because her
purpose.
spirit is broken.
Cold stone
The abbess
floors,
claimed,
unheated
"This is God's
dormitories,
will,"
and
but
minimal
Sister
furniture
Margaret
were
had
seen
seen
as
many
ways to
children
build
die in
character.
the same way.
At God's to
Their
Abbey,
bodies
a
seemed to give
visiting
up when
bishop
their
in
hearts were broken,
1278
she
AD
noted.
described the
The idea
dormitory
of
as
failure
colder
to
than a
thrive
tomb
wasn't known
and
back
darker
then,
than a
but
dungeon.
the symptoms
The
were
beds
clear.
were straw
Children who
mattresses on the
couldn't
floor,
cope with the harsh
thin wool
conditions would
blankets
slowly
that offered
waste
little
away,
warmth,
becoming
the
weak
windows
and
were small
lifeless,
and few,
eventually
leaving the
dying
rooms
without
in
any
constant
clear
twilight,
physical cause,
which added to the
Today's
oppressive
understanding
atmosphere.
of trauma would
Water for
recognize
washing
that
was
these
limited,
children's
and in
psychological
winter
stress
it
showed up
often
as physical
froze.
symptoms.
The children had to
leading
keep
to their
themselves
deaths.
clean. With
The
very few
education these
resources,
children
and if
received
they
was
failed,
minimal,
they were
and
punished.
focused only
At
on
Romsey
religious
Abbey,
teachings.
the rules
At
said,
Lock Abbey,
cleanliness
the
is
children
next
spent
to
their days
godliness,
memorizing
but
Latin
comfort
prayers,
is the enemy
reading
of devotion.
simple religious
The young
texts,
girls must
and
wash
learning
with cold
basic
water
skills like
and find joy
embroidery
in their
and copying
discomfort,
manuscripts.
for it reminds them
There was
of
no
their
instruction
earthly
in
nature
subjects like
and
math,
need for divine
science,
grace.
history,
The
or
psychological
literature,
impact of
except for
constant
religious
discomfort
texts.
was immense.
The goal wasn't
Children
to
who were
educate,
always
but
cold,
to
hungry,
indoctrinate.
and uncomfortable
Dame Ella
couldn't
of
focus on their
Salisbury,
prayers
who
or
founded
learning.
Lacock Abbey,
They were
wrote
fixated
in
on their physical
1232
needs,
AD,
which
let
created
the
a
young
cycle of
girls learn
suffering
only
that
what is
defeated the
necessary
very
to serve
purpose
God.
the Abbey's
Too
claim
much
to be
learning
pursuing.
creates pride,
At Barking
and
Abbey,
pride
a
leads to
visiting
sin.
physician
It's
noted
better
in
they remain
1285
ignorant
AD,
of worldly
the
knowledge,
children
and
here are
pure
so
in their
focused on
devotion,
their
and be
discomfort
clever with
that they
words,
can't
but corrupt
concentrate
in
on
their
their prayers.
hearts. They
This
shiver through
restriction on
mass,
education
fidget
served
during
many
lessons,
purposes,
and dream
it
of
kept the
warmth
children
instead of
dependent on their
salvation.
religious
religious leaders.
Social isolation
them
was
from
another
developing
method of
critical
control.
thinking
The
skills.
children
that
weren't
might
allowed to
challenge
form
authority,
friendships,
and
they were
ensured they
discouraged from
couldn't
showing
function
affection,
independently
and they were
if they
punished
ever
if they
left
showed
the abbey.
loyalty to anyone
The physical
other than their
conditions of
religious
these places
superiors
were harsh
a
on
Telto
purpose.
Abbey.
The
Cold
rules
stone
were
floors,
unheated
said,
dormitories,
special
and minimal
friendships of the
furniture
devil's
were seen
trap.
as ways to
The young
build
girls
character.
shall love everyone
At
equally,
God's to Abbey,
but not
a
anyone
visiting
in particular.
bishop in
They
1278
cannot
AD
exchange gifts,
described the
share
dormitory as
secrets,
colder than a
or show
tomb
preference
and
for any
darker than a
companion.
dungeon.
Their
The
hearts
beds
must
must
be
be
straw
reserved
mattresses
only for
on the
God.
floor.
This
With thin
rule
wool
created
blankets
deep
that offered
loneliness
little
and
warmth.
sadness.
The
Children
windows
who
were
had been
small
taken
and
from
few,
loving
leaving
families
the
were
rooms
now
in
surrounded
constant
by other
twilight,
kids, which added to
but
the
they couldn't
oppressive
form real
atmosphere.
bonds.
Water
The
for
natural
washing
human
was
need
limited,
for affection
and in winter it
companionship
often froze.
was seen as sinful.
The children had
which
to
only
keep
added to
themselves
their
clean
feelings
with
of
very
guilt
few
and shame.
resources.
Lady
If they
Alice
failed,
Deasy,
they
who
were
spent
punished.
5 years at
At
Romsey
Romsey
Abbey,
Abbey,
the rules
beginning in
said,
1301
cleanliness is
AD,
next to godliness.
I am
But
surrounded by
comfort
other
is the enemy
children,
of devotion.
but I feel more
Young
alone than
girls
if I were
must
the
wash
only
with
one in the
cold
world.
water. We
and
are
find
forbidden
joy in
from
their
comforting
discomfort,
each other,
for it
from
reminds
sharing
them
our
of their
sorrows,
earthly nature
from offering
and
friendship.
need for divine
We are
grace.
like islands in a
The
sea of
psychological
silence,
impact of
each
constant
drowning in
discomfort
our
was
own sorrow.
immense.
Children
The
who were
long-lasting
always
effects
cold,
of this
hungry, and
abuse were
uncomfortable
terrible.
couldn't
Many of
focus
the
on their
children who
prayers or
survived
learning.
into adulthood
They were
showed
fixated
signs
on
of
what
what
today's
today's
psychologists
psychologists would call
which created a
complex
cycle of
post-traumatic
suffering that
stress
defeated
disorder.
the very
They
purpose
found it
the
hard
Abbeys
to
claimed
trust
to be
others,
pursuing.
build
At
relationships,
Barking Abbey,
or live
a visiting
independently.
physician noted
Some
in
even became
1285
abbesses
AD,
themselves.
the children here
repeating
are
the
so
same
focused
harsh
on their
methods they had
discomfort
endured
that they can't
D.
concentrate
Margaret
on
of
their
Anjou,
prayers.
who
They
became
shiver
abbess
through
of
Mass,
Amesbury Abbey
fidget
in
during lessons,
1315 AD,
and dream of warmth
after spending
instead of
her childhood
salvation.
there.
Social
Wrote to
isolation
another
was
abbess,
another method of
I know
control.
no other way
The
to
children
train
weren't
children
allowed
than
to
as I
form
was
friendships.
trained.
They
The
were
rod and
discouraged from
harsh
showing
words were my
affection,
teachers,
and they were punished
they
if
shall
they
be the
showed
teachers
loyalty
for
to
the
anyone
children
other
in
than
my
their
care.
religious
I
superiors.
sometimes wonder if there
Elto
might be
Abbey,
gentler
the
ways,
rules were strict,
but I fear that
it was said,
kindness breeds
special
weakness,
friendships are the
and
devil's
weakness
trap.
breeds sin.
The young girls
The
shall love
cycle of
everyone
abuse seemed
equally, but
endless,
not anyone in
especially in
particular.
the religious
They
orders.
cannot exchange
Women
gifts,
who had been
share
abused as
secrets,
children
or show
often went
preference
on to
for
become
any
the abusers
companion.
of the next
Their hearts
generation,
must be reserved
passing
only
on
for
these
God.
cruel practices
This rule
like an
created deep
inheritance.
loneliness and
At
sadness.
Shaftesbury Abbey,
Children
the
who had been
same
taken
methods
from
of
loving
control and
families were
punishment
now
were used
surrounded
from the
by
12th
other kids,
century, but
all
they
the way
couldn't
through the
form real
16th
bonds.
century.
The natural
Continuing from
human
one
need for
generation of
affection and
abbesses to the
companionship
next.
was seen as sinful.
The
which only
exploitation
added
of
to
these
their
children's
feelings of
labour
guilt
was
and
also a
shame.
big part of the
Lady
system.
Alice D.C.,
The work
who
they
spent
did was
5
valuable
years
to
at
the
the
Convents,
Priory beginning
and they were
in
expected to work
1301
long
AD,
hours
wrote,
on top of their
I am
religious
surrounded
duties.
by other children.
At Wilton
but I
Abbey,
feel more
girls
alone
as
than
young
if I
as
were the
6
only
were
one
sent to
in
the
the world.
scriptorium.
We are
Where they
forbidden
spent
from
hours
comforting
copying
each other,
manuscripts,
from sharing
the
our
conditions
sorrows,
were cramped,
from offering
and the
friendship.
work damaged their
We are like
eyesight and
islands in a
physical
sea of
health.
silence.
The Abbey's
Each
financial
drowning in our
records
own
showed that
sorrow.
the sale of these
The
manuscripts
long-lasting
brought in a
effects of
lot
this
of
abuse
money.
were terrible.
Lady Constance
Many of the
Brittany,
children who survived
spent
into
7
adulthood
years at Wilton
showed
Abbey
signs of what
starting in
today's
1287
psychologists would
AD,
call complex
wrote,
post-traumatic
my
stress
hands are
disorder.
stained with ink
They
from
found it
hours
hard
of
to
copying.
trust others,
My back
build
is bent from
relationships,
hunching over
or
the
live
manuscripts.
independently.
My
Some
eyes
even
are strained
became
from
abbesses
working in dim
themselves.
light, repeating the
not
same
students
harsh
here.
methods they
We
had
are
endured.
labourers disguised as
Margaret of
novices,
Anjou,
who became
the children
abbess
who
of
worked in the
Amesbury
kitchens
Abbey
didn't
in
have it any better.
1315 AD.
At Barking
After
Abbey,
spending her
girls as
childhood
young as
there,
5
wrote to
helped
another
prepare
abbess,
meals.
I know no
using
other way to
sharp
train
knives
children
and
than
boiling
as I was
water with
trained.
very little
The rod and
supervision.
harsh words
Burns
were my
and cuts
teachers,
were common,
and they shall be
and
the
the nuns
teachers for the
showed
children
little
in my
sympathy.
care.
The
I
Abbey
sometimes
chronicler
wonder if there
noted,
might be
young
gentler
Matilda
ways,
burned her
but I
arm
fear
badly
that
while
kindness
stirring the
breeds
porridge.
weakness.
She
and
didn't
weakness
cry,
breeds sin.
which shows proper
The
spiritual
cycle of
development.
abuse seemed
Pain
endless.
teaches patience,
especially in the religious
patience
orders.
teaches
Women
devotion.
who had been abused as
Perhaps
children
the saddest
often
cases
went
were
on
those
to become the
children who never
abusers of
fully
the next
broke,
generation,
who held on to
passing
some
on these
part of
cruel
themselves
practices
despite
like
years
an
of
inheritance.
abuse.
These
At
children
Shaftesbury
often
Abbey,
suffered the
the
most
same
because
methods
their
of control and
resistance was seen
punishment
as
were
a sign
used
of
from the
spiritual
12th
corruption,
century,
all the way through
requiring
the
even
16th
harsher
century.
punishment.
Continuing
At
from
God's
one
to
generation
Abbey,
of
a girl named
abbesses to the
Johanna of
next.
Winchester,
The exploitation
3
of
years
these
in
children's
various
labour
forms
was
of
also a
punishment
big part of
for
the
repeatedly
system.
asking
The
about
work
her
they
family.
did was valuable
Eventually,
to the
she was
convents,
locked in
and
a
they were
tiny
expected
cell
to
where
work
she couldn't
long
even
hours
stand up.
on top of
She
their
was given
religious
only bread
duties.
and water and
At
forbidden
Wilton
to have
Abbey,
any human
girls as young
contact,
as 6 were
except
sent
for
to the
daily
scriptorium,
interrogations about
where they
whether she
spent
would submit
hours
to the
copying
Abbey's rules.
manuscripts.
The
records
conditions
from her
were cramped,
questioning and the work
preserved in the
damaged their
Abbey's
eyesight
files
and physical
show a girl
health.
with
The
extraordinary
Abbey's
courage
financial
being slowly
records show
destroyed
that
by
the
the
sale of
cruelty
these
of the
manuscripts
institution.
brought in a lot
She
of
asked,
money.
"Why
Lady
does
Constance
prayer
of
feel like
Brittany,
poison
who
in my
spent
mouth?
7 years at
Why
Wilton
do I
Abbey
dream of my
starting in
mother's face if I'm
1287
supposed to
AD,
forget her?"
wrote, "These
My
questions
hands
come
are
from my
stained with ink
heart,
from
not
hours
from
of
the
copying.
devil.
My
Why
back
my
is
heart
bent
so
from
evil?"
hunching over the manuscripts.
After 6 months of being
My
locked
eyes are
away,
strained from working
Johanna
in dim
stopped
light.
asking questions.
We are not students
She came out
here.
of her cell
We are
silent
labourers
and
disguised as novices.
Our eyes empty of the
children
fire
who
that
worked
once
in the
burned
kitchens
them.
didn't
The
have
Abbey
it any
chronicler
better.
wrote with
At
satisfaction.
Barking Abbey,
Johanna
girls as
has
young as
finally
5
achieved
helped
the
to
proper
prepare
state of
meals,
submission.
using sharp
You wake
knives
up
and
to the
boiling
loud
water
ringing of
with
bells
very
cutting
little
through the
supervision.
dark. Like
Burns
a
and
sharp
cuts were
sound
common,
piercing the
and the
quiet
nuns
night.
showed little
Your
sympathy.
breath forms little
The Abbey
clouds in
chronicler chronicler
cold air
noted,
of the dormitory.
young Matilda
and your
burned her
small
arm
hands
badly
shake
while
as you
stirring
pull
the
the
porridge.
rough woolen robe
She didn't
over your
cry,
head, which
You're
shows
only
proper
7 years
spiritual
old,
development,
and your bare feet
Pain
feel
teaches
cold
patience,
against the stone
and
floor.
patience
But you've
teaches
stopped
devotion.
noticing the chill
Perhaps
by
the
now.
saddest cases
Around
were
you,
those children
20
who
other
never fully
girls are
broke,
moving quietly,
who held on to
their
some part
faces
of
pale
themselves
like
despite
wax
years
in
of
the dim
abuse.
light coming through
These
small
children
windows.
often suffered the
One
most
girl,
because their
who can't
resistance
be
was
older
seen
than
as a sign
5,
of spiritual
struggling
corruption,
to put on her
requiring
robe.
even
You
harsher
want to help
punishment.
her, but you remember
At
what
God's to
happened to
Abbey,
Margaret
the girl
when she
named
tried to
Johanna of
comfort a
Winchester
crying
spent
child
3 years
last
in
week.
various forms
3
of
whole
punishment for
days without
repeatedly asking
food.
about her
3
family.
days of kneeling
Eventually,
on dried peas
she was locked in a
scattered across
tiny
the
cell
chapel
where she
floor
couldn't even
until her
stand up.
knees bled
She was
through
given
her
only bread
stockings.
and water, and
This isn't a
forbidden to have
school.
any human
This isn't a
contact
safe place.
except for daily
This is Whitby
interrogations about
Abbey in
whether she would
Yorkshire,
submit
England,
to the Abbey's
in the year
rules.
1247.
The records from her questioning,
And you're here not
preserved
because you
in the
want to
Abbey's
be,
files,
but because
show
your
a girl
father
with
needed to make a
extraordinary
deal
courage
with the
being
church.
slowly
He
destroyed
locked
by the
you in
cruelty
here,
of the
and
institution.
your childhood ended
She
the
asked,
moment those heavy
"Why does
wooden
prayer
doors
feel like
slammed
poison
shut
in my
behind you
mouth?
6 months
Why
ago?
do I dream of my
You'll
mother's
never see
face
your
if I'm
mother
supposed
again.
to forget her?"
You'll never run
These
through
questions come
fields or
from my
laugh
heart,
freely. not
You'll
from
never
the devil.
taste honey cakes
Why is
or
my
feel
heart
the
so
warmth of
evil?
family around a fireplace.
After 6 months of being locked
Instead,
away,
you'll spend the next
Johanna
10
stopped
years
asking
learning
questions.
what to survive here.
She came out
You
of her
must obey
cell silent and
perfectly.
obedient.
That hunger
Her
is a
eyes
way of
empty of the
serving
fire
God,
that had once
and that
burned in them.
silence is your
The
only
Abbey
friend.
chronicler wrote with
Before we dive
satisfaction,
deeper into these
Johanna
forgotten
has
stories of
finally
struggle and
achieved the
survival,
proper state of
if you enjoy
submission.
uncovering